In London's shadowy underworld, one family reigned supreme, the Addams brothers. Known as the Clerkenwell Crime Syndicate, Terry and Tommy Addams built an empire on violence, secrecy, and ruthless precision. Their criminal dynasty controlled millions, eluded police for decades, and forever reshaped Britain's criminal landscape. But every empire has its end, and theirs was spectacular. The story of Terry and Tommy Addams begins not with violence or wealth, but in the grey council estates of Islington, North London. The Addams family were one of 11 children, raised by a devout Irish Catholic mother and a father who earned little more than pocket change working in second-hand furniture. The family had deep working-class roots and lived in an area increasingly surrounded by crime, poverty, and gang culture in the 1960s and 70s. But the Addams boys were different. They weren't just surviving, they were observing. Terry, the eldest of the three main brothers, was known early on for his sharp mind, charm, and natural authority. Tommy, his younger sibling, was more volatile, impulsive, loyal, and feared for his temper. The youngest of the infamous trio, Patrick, would become the financial brain, but in the early days, he was just the quiet one in the background. Together, they would become the nucleus of what would later be dubbed the most feared crime syndicate in modern British history. At first, it was petty crime, shoplifting, burglary, and running errands for older criminals. But they quickly learned the rules of power. Loyalty was everything, violence was currency, and silence was survival. As teenagers, they ran errands for local gangsters. By their 20s, they had developed their own crews, running protection rackets around local pubs, clubs, and markets. What made them different was their discipline. The Addams brothers weren't wild or reckless. They avoided drugs themselves, preferring control and calculation. They moved quietly, spoke little, and punished betrayal brutally. Word spread quickly. The Addams boys weren't to be crossed. In an underworld often dominated by chaos, the Addams family introduced structure. They studied the mistakes of others and built something long-lasting, a legacy of control. It was in these formative years that the seeds of the Clerkenwell Crime Syndicate were planted, a gang that would come to dominate not only London's criminal landscape, but also reach far beyond its boroughs. And before we begin, please support my channel. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and stay active. It will help a lot. Thank you. By the early 1980s, the Addams brothers had evolved from local muscle into serious criminal players. Their operations expanded rapidly, and so did their ambitions. What had once been a loosely connected crew was now being molded into a disciplined, hierarchical crime syndicate, a British version of the Mafia. The press and police would later dub it the Clerkenwell Crime Syndicate, but those on the street knew it simply as the A-Team. The A-Team wasn't just about violence, it was strategy. Terry, always the brains of the operation, enforced military-style discipline among his men. He was a meticulous planner, preferring to build networks rather than leave blood on the pavement. His meetings were often held in silence, with hand gestures and codes. Members were taught to never speak openly, and surveillance paranoia ran deep, with reason. The gang focused on controlling London's protection rackets. If a club or pub didn't pay up, they were visited. Windows were smashed, fires were lit, people were beaten. But once they paid, they were genuinely protected. The A-Team saw themselves as providers of order in a city full of chaos. Even rivals knew that crossing them could mean disappearing without a trace. By the mid-80s, the Addams family had consolidated power in Islington, then pushed further into Clerkenwell, Camden, and King's Cross. Their influence began bleeding into Soho's sex trade, illegal gambling dens, and even the fringes of the West End entertainment industry. Through sheer intimidation, negotiation, and calculated violence, they built a web of loyal associates and fearful dependents. Tommy, now stepping into more leadership, became the enforcer, the face people saw when things went wrong. His presence was enough to make debtors reconsider their excuses. Meanwhile, Patrick, behind the scenes, was already experimenting with sophisticated money laundering operations, funneling cash through shell companies, property investments, and offshore accounts. This was no street gang, it was a corporation. The A-Team began recruiting ex-military men, former enforcers from rival outfits, and even bent police officers. Their operations were slick, their tactics professional. They weren't interested in petty squabbles or street-level chaos, they were building an empire. And just like that, London had a new criminal elite, an organization that refused to call itself a gang, but operated like a government in the shadows. The A-Team had arrived, and no one in London's criminal underworld could afford to ignore them. As the 1990s approached, the Clerkenwell Crime Syndicate was no longer just a London powerhouse. It had become a multi-million-pound criminal enterprise with international reach. Drugs, extortion, arms, fraud, and money laundering were all part of the machine. But it was their ability to move vast sums of money, and keep their hands clean, that truly set them apart. Terry Adams, the tactician, pushed the syndicate beyond street-level operations. Under his guidance, the A-Team forged links with Colombian cocaine cartels, Dutch drug traffickers, and even Balkan arms dealers. The syndicate became a hub, a middleman with the infrastructure to move serious weight, whether it was kilos of cocaine through Essex ports or firearms from Eastern Europe. But they were careful. Terry avoided flashy cars and public displays of wealth. He operated through layers of intermediaries using burner phones and coded language. Associates rarely spoke his name, even in private. MI5 would later describe him as one of the most disciplined and surveillance-aware crime figures they had ever encountered. Tommy, meanwhile, was becoming more unpredictable. Known for his brutal efficiency, he was involved in collecting debts, intimidating witnesses, and controlling territory. Stories spread of his violent temper and unshakable loyalty to the family. Where Terry built systems, Tommy enforced them. The real genius, though, was Patrick. He set up offshore trusts, fake companies, and complex real estate deals to clean millions in dirty cash. Adams-linked firms bought and sold restaurants, betting shops, flats, and mansions across London. Legitimate-looking businesses became laundering pipelines. Some reports suggested the syndicate was shifting over £200 million a year, undetected. By now, their name inspired fear not only among criminals but also within law enforcement. Detectives spoke of coded silence, of intimidated witnesses, of entire communities refusing to speak. Lawyers, bankers, and even politicians were rumored to have rubbed shoulders with them. Some turned a blind eye, others were too afraid to intervene. The A-Team had become more than a gang. It was an underground empire built on fear, loyalty, and strategic brilliance. It moved like smoke, hard to grasp, harder to contain. With wealth flowing in and power centralized under the three brothers, they seemed unstoppable. But in every empire's rise, the seeds of its fall begin to grow. And in the Adams family's case, it started with too many secrets and too many people watching. For all its corporate polish and strategic finesse, the Clerkenwell Crime Syndicate still ran on one of the oldest currencies in the underworld: fear. Behind the offshore accounts and front businesses was a network of violence, threats, and disappearances. The Adams brothers didn't just build their empire, they enforced it with blood and concrete. Whispers of bodies buried beneath construction sites and behind nightclub walls became part of London's criminal folklore. The A-Team never left evidence, rarely faced witnesses, and never tolerated disloyalty. Tommy, in particular, earned a reputation as a ruthless enforcer. Associates who crossed the family, or even looked like they might, were said to vanish, often permanently. One infamous case involved a rival gangster who refused to pay a debt. He was last seen being bundled into a van in North London. His remains were never found. In another chilling story, a suspected informant was discovered dead in a canal, hands bound and mouth taped. Though no formal charges ever stuck to the Adams brothers, the message was always clear: betrayal would cost you everything. Police believed the syndicate was responsible for dozens of unsolved assaults, murders, and disappearances throughout the late 80s and 90s, but fear paralyzed investigations. Victims' families were too terrified to speak. Jurors looked nervous. Even seasoned detectives were cautious about pushing too hard. And still, the A-Team operated with surgical precision. They didn't leave fingerprints. They didn't brag. Even in their most violent acts, they were calculated, using trained professionals and tightly controlled plans. In many ways, they functioned like a private army. Their fearsome reputation only strengthened their position. Rivals backed off. Witnesses kept quiet. Businesses paid protection without resistance. The streets weren't ruled with chaos, they were ruled with cold order. But beneath this concrete wall of silence, cracks were forming. Technology was advancing, surveillance was improving, and behind closed doors, British intelligence agencies were beginning to take a deeper interest in the so-called British Mafia. The Addams family had built a fortress of fear, but the storm was coming. While the streets of North London whispered about disappearances and intimidation, the Addams brothers worked tirelessly to present another face to the world, that of legitimate businessmen and wealthy socialites. It was a facade built not only to confuse investigators, but also to gain access to circles of power and prestige. Terry Addams, in particular, cultivated an image of refinement. He was seen dining in high-end restaurants, mingling with celebrities, and even donating to charities. His fashion was sharp, his speech measured, and his manner calm. In public, there was no sign of a criminal past, only the persona of a successful property developer or investor. The family's laundering operation helped reinforce this illusion. Dirty money flowed into real estate across London, townhouses in Islington, penthouses in the Docklands, and entire blocks in North London suburbs. The syndicate also had interests in restaurants, pubs, security firms, and car dealerships. They created shell companies that moved funds between them, making tracking nearly impossible. Terry's wife, Ruth, ran a number of these businesses and was described in court documents as a key figure in concealing the origins of their wealth. Together, they lived in a multi-million-pound mansion in Finchley, complete with antique furnishings, luxury cars, and original artworks. On paper, everything looked legitimate. Even within high society, the Addams name began to find its way into polite conversation, always cloaked in mystery. Rumors swirled of connections to politicians, actors, and respected business figures. Some claimed the family attended exclusive functions. Others suggested they held silent shares in West End productions. This calculated duality, ruthless violence behind closed doors, polished elegance in the open, made the syndicate harder to target. The police didn't just face gangsters. They faced businessmen with barristers, accountants, and influence. But the pretense couldn't hold forever. Behind the designer suits and art collections were wiretaps, secret recordings, and growing files in the hands of investigators. Terry Addams may have built a facade of legitimacy, but MI5 and the National Crime Squad were finally ready to tear it down. By the late 1990s, the Clerkenwell Crime Syndicate had drawn too much attention to ignore. Their name appeared in multiple police intelligence reports, and internal chatter at MI5 began to circulate about the untouchables of Islington. What had once been a low-level gang had transformed into a national threat, and Britain's top crime-fighting agencies were preparing to strike. The National Crime Squad launched Operation Tiberius, a wide-reaching investigation into organized crime and police corruption. The Addams brothers were among its prime targets. Wiretaps, surveillance, and undercover operatives were deployed, not just in London, but across Europe. Law enforcement suspected the syndicate was operating with assistance from corrupt officials, and breaking through that wall would take years. Terry Addams became the key focus. Investigators tapped his phones, bugged his home, and followed every step. But Terry was careful. He spoke in code, used intermediaries, and often avoided saying anything incriminating. It became a game of cat and mouse, and Terry was a master at staying one move ahead. MI5 agents, usually focused on national security threats, were brought in to assist due to the complexity of the syndicate's communications and money flows. Surveillance specialists used long-lens cameras, vans rigged with listening devices, and planted bugs in homes and offices. But the real breakthrough came from within. Rumors of discontent within the syndicate began to circulate. Associates were getting nervous about increased police pressure, about being made scapegoats, and about aging leaders making mistakes. The old code of silence began to crack. In 2003, after years of surveillance, investigators caught Terry Addams discussing business with an associate, not through vague phrases, but in detail. The recordings were clear enough to form the backbone of a criminal case. Terry had slipped, and the law was ready. In 2007, after a protracted trial, Terry Adams pleaded guilty to money laundering and was sentenced to 7 years in prison. It was a symbolic victory. The boss of Britain's most feared syndicate, jailed, exposed, and no longer invisible. But this was just the beginning. Tommy and Patrick were still out there. The syndicate still had reach. And as one brother fell, another would soon rise into focus. Terry Adams' imprisonment was only the first domino. With the once untouchable leader behind bars, authorities shifted their attention to his brothers. Tommy and Patrick had relied heavily on Terry's strategic mind, and his absence left them exposed. The carefully constructed empire began to falter, and law enforcement wasted no time exploiting its vulnerabilities. Tommy Adams had always been the iron fist of the operation. Without Terry's caution, he became more aggressive and, ultimately, more reckless. Police watched as Tommy became embroiled in conflicts that he would once have handled with precision. The cracks widened. In 2014, his volatile temper finally brought about his downfall. Tommy was arrested for his involvement in a brutal attack linked to a debt dispute, captured vividly on CCTV. It was the kind of evidence the Adams family had spent decades meticulously avoiding. At trial, prosecutors unraveled Tommy's violent history. Witnesses, emboldened by the brothers' declining power, testified openly for the first time. Tommy was convicted of grievous bodily harm and money laundering, receiving a significant prison sentence. Another pillar of the Clerkenwell Crime Syndicate had fallen. Patrick Adams, the financial genius behind the syndicate, proved harder to corner. Quiet, cautious, and elusive, Patrick had long operated behind the scenes, shrouded in secrecy. But in 2016, even his carefully maintained invisibility shattered. Investigators unearthed extensive evidence linking Patrick to complex financial fraud, illegal investments, and offshore laundering operations. A multinational investigation revealed his network of shell companies, hidden trusts, and lavish assets funded by criminal earnings. Facing overwhelming evidence, Patrick fled to Amsterdam, hoping to evade extradition. However, British and Dutch authorities coordinated a dramatic international sting, capturing him in a luxury apartment overlooking the canals. His extradition was swift, and he faced trial back in London. In 2017, Patrick pleaded guilty to money laundering and was sentenced to prison. With Terry, Tommy, and Patrick all behind bars, the Clerkenwell Crime Syndicate was in disarray. The sprawling criminal empire they'd spent decades building had finally crumbled under the relentless pressure of the law. The British Mafia, as the press called them, had been dismantled, at least officially. But legacies built on fear and fortune don't vanish overnight, and the Adams shadow continued to loom large over London. By the 2000s, the Clerkenwell Crime Syndicate was no longer the untouchable empire it had once been. The Adams brothers, each imprisoned at various times, had lost their direct hold over London's criminal underworld. But the legacy they left behind was far from over. Their name alone remained synonymous with organized crime, power, and fear, forever etched into Britain's criminal history. Even from prison, Terry Adams continued to command respect. Reports surfaced of him orchestrating operations through coded letters and whispered conversations during prison visits. Although weakened, the syndicate continued to influence smaller gangs and factions across North London, reminding everyone that the Adams' reach, though diminished, had not entirely faded. The brothers' fall became a lesson in law enforcement circles, cited as proof that even the most powerful criminal organizations could be dismantled. However, police acknowledged the enormous effort required. Decades of surveillance, infiltration, and meticulous planning. Their story became a blueprint for tackling organized crime across the UK. Meanwhile, London's streets still bore scars from their reign. Businesses that once paid protection money struggled to shake off the fear instilled by decades of intimidation. Entire communities remained hesitant to speak openly about the syndicate's history, mindful of lingering loyalties and unsolved mysteries. In popular culture, the Adams family became legends, anti-heroes in films, documentaries, and crime literature. Their exploits inspired books, television series, and investigative journalism, perpetuating their mystique even as their criminal empire dissolved. Yet behind this notoriety was a trail of broken lives, violence, and untraceable millions, a dark underbelly of glamorized gangland myths. Today, Terry, Tommy, and Patrick Adams remain powerful symbols, reminders of the thin line between wealth and crime, respectability and brutality. They represent a chapter of British criminal history that many would prefer forgotten, yet few can ignore. The Clerkenwell Crime Syndicate's true legacy isn't measured solely by the fortune they amassed or the fear they instilled. Rather, it's measured by the lasting impact they had on Britain's collective psyche. The Adams brothers had built their empire with blood, money, and silence, and though their rule ended, their legend endures, casting a long, dark shadow across London's past and present.